One man, just one man in the grand scheme of American politics cares about the Constitution. The Trump train storms the Capitol, and the response from Republicans and Democrats will shock you. I'm Josiah Everton, and this is The Glorious Rescue.
Aren't you tired of feeling forced to choose between staying informed and being indoctrinated? Listen to the condensed news cycle without the lies, agendas, and confusion from the mainstream media, all while engaging in deeper discussions about the principles that have influenced our great nation. This is what rescuing America looks like. This is The Glorious Rescue.
Welcome back to another episode of The Glorious Rescue. We have lots to cover. This is a little bit harder of an episode for me to record. A little bit more confusing of an episode just because I have a lot to cover just from one day, and that is 2 days ago. I want to say yesterday, but I need to remember the day after coming out as the releasing of the episode. So there's lots to cover. I'm going to make a lot of enemies in this episode. I know so. So just let me give you this label, this little label. I don't know if I can pop it up at the bottom or just say it right here. And that is, every opinion expressed in this video is solely my own or something along those lines. And you don't have to agree if you don't want to. You can just say, okay, mark it down. This is what Josiah believes. Great. Let's move on to the next episode. And you don't have to care because in reality, there are a lot of political commentators right now that I'm listening to, and I just don't care because they are wrong in my opinion. And so remember, this is America. I'm going to make a lot of maybe make enemies, but these are my own opinions. You can have yours. Great. This is America. Have your own opinions and agree to disagree, I guess. But we're going to talk about why I might make some enemies, what I disagree with, and the response from Republicans and Democrats that have been absolutely detrimental and really ridiculous. And we're going to get into all of that. So first things first. There's a vast difference between voter procedure, voter irregularity, and voter fraud. I've heard this on a couple different levels. But voter procedure, voter irregularities, and voter fraud. Voter procedures, I'm 100% in agreement with every single Republican that the whole thing is ridiculous and quote-unquote rigged, right? The idea that we can have unilateral mail-in balloting and no really credential checking and whatnot. Yes, that's wrong. There are not the correct processes in place. There are some things wrong with the American voting system. I 100% agree. Voter irregularities, of course, there are voter irregularities. We've seen the videos. We've seen the evidence of hundreds of votes being switched here by Dominion or 1,000 votes here, or you have random videos of people pulling ballots out of suitcases and all these different little items, right? That seem to be voter irregularities. People with certain counties with high voter turnout. There are things that are irregular in the grand scheme of American voting, especially in this last election, 2020. The question comes to voter fraud, systemic voter fraud. When it comes to widespread voter fraud in the area that Trump is claiming of tens of millions, I think he said at one point. So Trump lost by what, around 7 million? So, he doesn't need 7 million or 8 million to win. He just needs that little bit in each swing state. I guess you could make the argument that there's only a little bit in each, but we're talking widespread. We're talking massive scale. The idea that there are tens of millions, as he said at one point, of fraudulent, invalid ballots. So that's where the differentiation comes. Again, I think I say it because I fall more on the side of I would much rather say, well, that's a ridiculous claim, because it is a ridiculous claim. Whether or not it's true or not, that's a crazy claim. That's a wild claim. And so you are going to have to prove that with wild evidence, right? And so I'll just say, I would rather be on the side of saying, well, that's kind of a crazy accusation. That's a wild thing to say. And I don't really believe it unless you show me the evidence. Then to get on the train of saying, oh yeah, there's tens of millions of invalid ballots and widespread systemic voter fraud to the point of switching who the president is in an election. I would much rather say that that's a ridiculous claim to make, and I need ridiculous amounts of evidence to prove that. And to be convinced, if it does come out, then to be convinced of that, then to fall on the side of this is what happened. Trump, the election was stolen from Trump. To fall on that side and make those claims, and then there's no evidence that comes out for it. That is why I make the statements that I do. If it comes out, great, I stand behind it. I'm not against that. I do obviously 100% believe that the voter procedures are completely skewed in America. I think that the voter irregularities, there have been way too large of numbers of voter irregularities, way too many instances because of these voter procedure issues. But the idea of systemic voter fraud on such a huge scale, we're talking millions and millions of ballots, I see as highly unlikely, and I don't see the evidence for that. You say, well, Josiah, look at this video. Look at this little video. Or Josiah, look at this, or this instance of the Dominion switching. Again, voter irregularities. Yes, there are those. I do not deny those. We have seen evidences of those. But again, the idea of widespread voter fraud, I've said it before on the show. If I thought it exists and if it was as large and wide scale as people say it is, then why has it not been found out? It's too big to be swept under the rug at this point. Again, we've seen over 50 federal court cases, and I mean, we're talking a whole bunch of legislative hearings. That's not even including all the amount of lawsuits that were thrown out because of a lack of standing. I'm talking 50 actual federal court cases in regards to voter fraud. Nothing's really come up substantiated for this huge, large amount of it. We're talking DOJ has come out and really said, yeah, we're not seeing instances of widespread voter fraud. So again, I will make that claim. You don't have to if you don't want to. You can disagree with me. And if the evidence comes out, you can say, haha, gotcha, Josiah. And you know what? I'll say, you're right. Great. That's wonderful. And I'm happy. And then there's enough evidence and now we can tackle this together. Because obviously I side on wanting Donald Trump to be president, not Joe Biden. But again, I'm not going to make those types of claims if I don't have the evidence to back it up. And I haven't really seen any evidence to back it up. Next, we move into the constitutionality of it. And this is where it gets really sad. It gets really sad because if we disagree on that previous statement, the idea of systemic voter fraud, it's just really an evidence issue. Oh, okay, Josiah and I disagree, but he just needs to see more evidence of it because obviously he would want to tackle that issue. I'm not just totally in denial and not wanting to see it and trying to hide it and whatnot, right? But when it comes to the constitutionality of it, this is where I see myself disagreeing with the vast majority of Republicans, and it's very unfortunate to me. I find it very disheartening to think that there are so many Republicans that believe what's being touted. Like, for instance, Charlie Kirk, he talked about the whole 12th Amendment thing, and Vice President Mike Pence has the opportunity to just pick the president. And he even made the statement, and I love Charlie Kirk, I'm grateful for all he does. He even made the statement that, do I agree with it? No. Should he do it? Like, is it there? Yes. And I thought, how ridiculous. You disagree with the principle. You think it's an awful process in place in the American Constitution if you believe it's there. I don't believe it's there. If you believe it's there. And you would never want anyone to take advantage of it unless it benefits you. And if it does benefit you, then you want to take advantage of it, right? It's, again, that's the idea. That's when I talk about, I have made reference to him and the Machiavellian ideas. You have a lot of conservatives, you have a lot of political commentators coming out and saying that. There are very few who stand on the side of, have you ever read the 12th Amendment and looked at it honestly and ever come to the conclusion that it says what you're trying to make? Have you ever come to that? Have you ever come to the conclusion that anywhere in the Constitution, the legislative branch, Congress, has the power to overturn state certified elections unilaterally? Because every 4 years, that just means we're going to have a grasp of power. And the incumbent vice president is just going to pick the next president, or you're going to have whoever holds the majority in the Congress is going to be picking the president. That's the point I'm trying to make here, right? Again, the 12th Amendment, in my opinion, never says that. Just because the vice president gets to count the votes, somehow that means he gets to decide the votes. He gets to choose who is voted in for. There's no correlation. Charlie Kirk, he tried to show some precedents too that aren't really there. Talked about like Nixon, and he said Nixon way back when decades ago, he did not. And then he tried to say because Nixon did not, that means he chose not to. And because he chose not to, that means he could have chose to do it, meaning that he had the choice, meaning it's valid. And then he tried to say something about Thomas Jefferson back in the 1800s that didn't really apply either. So the precedent isn't there. The actual power in the U.S. Constitution is not there. There has been nothing from I have seen from the United States Constitution or any legislative act that has deemed or given Congress the power or given the president of the Senate the power to unilaterally decide the president in stark contrast with state certified elections. Again, that is the issue. Again, it's also the issue with the whole federal courts, because do federal courts really have the power to overturn a state certified election? Really, it should be maybe state courts, or it should be even state legislators, because it's a direct election issue. It's a direct election issue. So legislators would be the ones involved. State legislators have had the chance. There have been too many to count legislative hearings all across states and states legislators, right? And nothing's come of that either. Like I said, 50 court case hearings that have actually gone through, and no really evidence substantiated or no really overturning of any election results. Because again, these are state certified election results, I should say. And the idea of them being overturned by one man in the president and the Senate, Mike Pence, or just the Congress in general, or even state legislators, I think that's a little bit more of an argument to make there. But that idea is ridiculous in my mind. Again, you can come to your own conclusion there. You can do your own research, and I'm happy for you to do so, and you can disagree, and we can discuss it. I mean, all power to you. That's great. That's what America's for. That's what America is, right? The idea that we can live in a free country where we can exchange political ideas, religious ideas, all these different ideas in a civil manner, and we can change each other's minds, or we can assure our own minds, or we can just engage in that dialogue, even contested dialogue, or highly debated debates and discussions. And we can still come to our own conclusions because we have the right to our own opinions. Again, going back to the whole idea of Congress overturning state-certified election results. State-certified election results, again, the idea of that. We come to another individual, and that is Ted Cruz. And all for Ted Cruz, and grateful for the stand. And so he made a contesting point, I guess you could say, in the Senate. There were some people who raised objections, some people who said they were going to and decided, no, I'm not going to, because of the violence that we're going to talk about in just a second. But Ted Cruz still did, and all power to him. You can have your own opinion. I think it was a very, very weak argument by saying that we should overturn the state-certified elections because 41% of Americans believe that the election was rigged. Quote unquote, the election was rigged. When asked, according to a recent survey, 41%, I believe, of Americans said that they believed that the election was quote-unquote rigged. That is a very sad number, right? That goes back to the whole idea of voter procedures, that our voter procedures are so skewed that there is a large percentage of American people that believe that the election was rigged. But again, just because there's a certain percentage of the American population that thinks that the election was rigged doesn't mean that you as Congress has the power to overturn the election. So again, a weak argument, but just laying out his position that he believes that there's widespread voter fraud. So I'm not really going to, rake him over the coals for it because that's his own opinion. That's great. And I would want to side on his side, that there is so much systemic fraud that the presidency was stolen from Trump. But again, I can't say that in good conscience without seeing the evidence. And again, I do think it was a poor argument. So now moving into Donald Trump's poor arguments. And this is the stuff that really drives me crazy because 4 or 5 years ago when he was running, that was the whole frustration I had with Trump, was who he was as a person, because I thought he was inflammatory. I don't think he's a very presidential person. And come to find out, I'm exactly right. And we all knew this. He always does this, right, on Twitter or things back and forth. And I do think a lot of times his pros outweigh his cons. There's been many times on the show that I've given a long list of things, of reasons why I like President Trump. But when it comes to why I don't, this is why. Because of how unpresidential he acts. And again, he doesn't want to concede, and he has committed to a peaceful transition, which I'm all for, okay? If I truly believe that the election was stolen from me, those are probably the words I would say, that I'm not going to concede because I do not believe I lost, but I will go ahead and still follow through with a peaceful transition. But that's not really what Trump has said. That's what he's doing. Again, that's kind of what goes through my mind with Trump is I maybe sometimes agree with what he's doing, but the way he says it is ridiculous and inflammatory and unpresidential. And here's what I'm talking about. He gets up 2 days ago, January 6th, I know I'm dating this episode now, and he gives his address to the tens of thousands of people marching in D.C. And he basically says, the election's stolen, I'm not going to concede, Pence isn't on our side, the Supreme Court isn't on our side, and I'm going to walk you now to the Capitol. Talk about, what do you think's going to happen? And don't get me wrong, I'm not blaming Trump for the violence. I hold the same standard for accusing someone of inciting violence as Ben Shapiro would, and that is unless that person directly calls on that crowd, and in the moment that he calls on that crowd, or she or whoever calls on that crowd to incite a specific act of violence on a specific person, and they then immediately go and do so, then I will go ahead and say that person is inciting violence. But I think it's hard to just say that because Trump used some inflammatory language and then walked into the Capitol, that does not in any way mean that Trump was condoning it. That doesn't mean that Trump incited it, but I will say that Trump used substantially, very inflammatory language to the point of riling up his supporters and then had them walk right to the Capitol. So again, the things he said too in this address, he said, we will never concede. Okay, fine. He said, this is what he said about Pence. And by the way, Pence's staff is still not allowed in the White House. So I guess the high school girl drama is still going on right now. But he says, this was a couple days, a day or two before the actual hearing. He said on Facebook, I think it was, I found, he says, if Pence comes through for us, we'll have another 4 more years or something like that. That is not what Pence's job is. I've already talked about it on the show. That is not what the president of the Senate is there for. He's not to come through for you as his boss. That is not his job. Another thing he said about the Supreme Court is he said something like, Well, let me go back to Pence first, because then in this specific address where he was talking to his tens of thousands of supporters on the day that all this happened, he said something along, well, actually, he said Pence didn't have the courage to protect our Constitution. Yeah, Pence actually had the courage to stand up to you, to stand up to the however many millions of Americans that think the election was rigged. Or, I mean, even if you believe that the election was rigged, you may still not agree or disagree that whether or not Pence should be able to do that. So I guess that's not necessarily true, but you understand what I'm saying. All the people, he had the courage to stand up to all those people that think he should have overturned all the state certified election results to push his boss through for another 4 more years. You have all those people who think he should have. He had the courage to stand up to those people, the people that were standing there at Capitol Hill waiting for his decision. He had the courage to stand up to President Trump, his boss, because he believed that he did not have the right to do so. And he did what he believed was standing within the confines of the Constitution. And I believe that Pence is one of the most honorable men in American politics today. I also believe he's one of the most, he has one of the most cohesive worldviews when it comes to American politics and the American Constitution. And I respect that man deeply. I don't think he's a traitor. I think that is wildly ridiculous to call him a traitor. Again, evidence comes out. I'm happy to stand on that side. But I think Pence is probably one of the most honorable men in American politics. And calling him a traitor because your president did not win and all of the legal processes happened. And my president, don't get me wrong, my president didn't win. And then all the legal processes went through and he still he was not able to substantiate the claims that he made in regards to election fraud. And he did not win. Does not mean you get to call Pence a traitor. Again, defamation, I guess. So the things he said about Pence, incorrect, wrong, and I think evil. I really do. And then the whole inflaming his supporters and then taking them to the Capitol gates as well, I think is evil. And then also his mentality about the Supreme Court came through. And this is what I'm talking about when I say I feel like when Trump gets up and he talks and he says what he wants to say and he doesn't really have a brief and he doesn't really have someone telling him, his speaking points, and he kind of just goes on his Trump rants, you start to see who he really is. Because when it came to the Supreme Court, he basically said, I put on all of these different people, I nominated 3 different people, I fought hard for them, and now they're disloyal, they won't fight for me. Again, that means that you see the Supreme Court as a tool. You see it as a loyalty issue. You see it as a favor. I put you on and now you do me a favor. That type of thing. That's not what the Supreme Court is. We know this. And here on the Glorious Rescue, it will be stated that the Supreme Court is not the tool of the president to simply wield at his own will. That he gets to do favors for and they turn around and do favors for them because it's a loyalty game or it's a political game. That is not what the Supreme Court is there for. You have your constitutional right as president and your duty to appoint a justice. And if that justice is approved and he's therefore nominated and placed on the bench, it is his job or her job to protect and defend the Constitution. That's what the oath is. It is not the president. Your job, you did not take the oath to the president. You took it to the Constitution. You took it to the great and wonderful United States of America, and it is their duty to do what they believe upholds that Constitution. And that, again, goes to show you the worldview or sometimes the political view that Donald Trump has. And I think, generally speaking, when it comes to his presidency, he does not act that way. But when he gets on his own speaking terms, on his own speaking points, and he starts to talk on his own, he shows that. And you can see it throughout all of his history. He has that mentality. And I think it's a business mentality. I think it's because he's not necessarily very politically astute that he kind of thinks that. I think it's kind of who he is and him growing up in business, if that makes sense, right? He kind of has that mentality. But again, that's not really what it's for. Okay, so now I have a very limited amount of time, but I'm going to talk about I'm going to very briefly talk about the storming of the Capitol. It is wrong. It is evil. It was violent. And I'm not even going to get into, if you're going to call out this violence, then you better be calling out BLM violence. And because that's the backlash that you're getting from people on the right and the left, Republicans and Democrats. Well, if you're going to call out this violence, why don't you call out BLM? Like the point of all of this, where you have barbarians storming our United States Capitol and destroying private property and injuring police, and you're really going to sit there and try to talk about the hypocrisy of CNN? Like, that is not the point here. The point here is that you had these people that were so inflamed that they stormed the Capitol, injured police. There's videos of blood all over the ground. I mean, I'm not even going to get into it because it's grotesque. Yes, several individuals died. One was shot specifically by the police. And then you have 2 or 3 others, like medical emergencies, that ended up passing away or something like that. So that is, again, going back to it, is I'm not even going to sit here and say, well, if you're going to call, like, why would I preface that? Why would I preface this discussion with, well, if you're going to call out this violence, you better call out the BLM violence in May, June, and July, right? You should remain logically consistent. And again, if you are going to call out the BLM violence months ago, then you should be calling out this violence. In no way should you try to justify the violence that occurred in the past few days just because the left did not call out the violence back in May, June, and July. That would be ridiculous. That would be you becoming the thing that you call out in anyone else. And I say that to myself as well, because sometimes I want to get into that mentality of, oh, look at the hypocrisy. And it's very true. But the point is that it is a very sad day in American politics when this happens, when you have people so emotional over political dialogue and the political unfoldings in our nation that you have them storming the Capitol. Again, destruction of private property. It is acts of vandalism, acts of violence, injuring people, injuring police, and they should go to jail for it, right? They should serve time for it. So anyways, that's the storming of the Capitol that happened after the Trump train, I guess you could say. Not everyone on the Trump train, right? You could say you're on the Trump train, but not agree with the violence. I think that's understandable. Unfortunately, it does give us a bad rap when it comes to now Democrats. The headlines now are all over the place, especially because some of them had Confederate flags. So thank you now. The discussion is going to be all about the white supremacists at the Capitol as well. But nevertheless, that's the summary of what happened just a few days ago. So, in conclusion, because I do believe this episode was a little bit more scattered, and I apologize for that. It was not due to a lack of preparation. It was due to a lack of understanding how to really discuss the nature of what went on just a few days ago. But just in conclusion, again, these are my own opinions. This is what I believe. You can differ from me 100%. That's fine. That's great. I do think there are some very important parts, and that is making huge and wild claims without being substantiated by evidence. Of course, if the evidence comes out, I think we should always back it. The whole idea that we need to revamp our voting procedures, I think that's something we agree with. Remembering the idea, too, that if it's so widespread and so wide thought of by so many Americans, that if it's so big, the idea of systemic voter fraud, that if it actually were true, it couldn't be swept under the rug because it's so big at this point. And then again, yes, Democrats did contest the election in Congress in 2000, 2004, 2016. So, Republicans can do so in general, but I don't think it is the right of Congress, the vice president, even the Supreme Court to overturn state certified election results. I know it came out much more opinionated in this episode than I have in previous, and I think it was because I was waiting for more information to come out. Nothing has come out, and then something so wild, so vast that I have to make a very direct statement about what I do believe on the issue. And then again, the worst of Trump kind of coming out, his personality, what he believes about American politics. It is unfortunate, it is sad, but again, I do not believe that he directly incited this violence. I think that's wrong to put this violence on the tab of Donald Trump. He doesn't want to concede, but he will go for a peaceful transition of power. That is something I agree with. I wish he would just simply stick to that speaking line, right? Because that is what he's doing, and I think that's a good position to follow. And then also calling out Pence, calling out the Supreme Court, like I said, is wrong. Storming the Capitol is wrong. It's violent. It's not the second American Revolution. That's not what this is, because, again, it's not substantiated by evidence. The Declaration of Independence states prudence will dictate when it talks about declaring independence. And I just ask, when you look at these people literally dressed as barbarians, dressed as like all these wild things, and going and standing in the chambers and walking around and injuring police and blood all over the floor, ask yourself this question: do you think prudence is really dictating this? I do not. And again, the whole purpose, the main discussion and talking point of this should not be the hypocrisy from the media, although I do believe there's way too much hypocrisy in the mainstream media over this, but it should be the sadness in our hearts because the way that American politics has degraded throughout our history. And it's a sad note. It's a sad note to end this episode on, but it is a note that I give to challenge you to continue to share this episode, to continue to share the show, The Glorious Rescue, because I do believe that this message here is the message that should ring throughout America to be able to help us, to remind us that we are not above degradation. We are all man, we are all sinful, and we as a nation, America as a nation, can degrade. And it is our duty as American patriots to try to stem and stay away that degradation through either our own lives, through sharing what should be shared, and just being the individuals that we should be. We talked about raising your children right as a way to do so, sharing good types of content, and things like that. Those are all ways that we can exemplify those statesmanship qualities that will rescue our America and our beloved nation. And again, if that is something that you agree with, something that you want to support, I do encourage you to continue sharing this episode and sharing the show in general. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Josiah Evertson, and this is The Glorious Rescue.